And the school leader of the DBS is from Zimbabwe.
What's the name?
That's, I'll tell you in just a moment. I'm now spaced out that he's from Zimbabwe. And Nick Guerrero.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so you know people from South Africa, they're based there.
I was in South Africa.
Oh, good.
Before I came to Germany.
Ah, good. Barney, do I pronounce it correct?
Bernie, yeah.
Bernie?
Yeah.
You are from Scandinavia or from here? Yeah, and we have Hurlach here too, so.
My full name is
Barney,
Bernard.
Huh?
My full name is Bernard.
Bernard. Okay, but you usually go by the name of
Bernie.
Bernie.
Yeah.
Okay, Uli from Colombia.
Well, I'm from Venezuela, but I came from Colombia.
You're from where?
Venezuela.
Venezuela. Okay, good. But you came from the basic
Yeah.
Colombia. You're the one I all know about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. And Uli, that sounds also German. Uli is also a German name.
Oh well, it's my nickname here.
Okay. Because your original name is too difficult to remember, is it?
Well, I don't know. But yeah, it's Ulises.
Okay.
Ulises, yeah.
I will call you Uli.
Uli, it's okay.
Good. All right. Then we have Crystal.
Yes.
Where are you from?
America.
America.
Where? Wisconsin.
Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Okay. I live in Hawaii.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know, it's a tough location, but somebody has to do it. So Anna,
Yes,
where are you from?
Germany.
Germany. Good. And where in Germany?
East of Germany, so Saxony.
Okay, good. Jaeun? Jane?
Jaen, yeah.
Jaeun. Okay, from Korea.
Yes.
Good. Seoul?
No, from Ulsan, it's in the southern part.
Busan.
It's near.
Oh, I know
yeah.
Busan. I've been there.
Mhm.
Yeah, good. Lina?
Right, yeah. From Germany.
Germany. Good. And then Ula?
Hola.
Ula also from Germany, I think.
Poland.
Huh?
Poland.
Oh, Poland. Okay, good. And then Sabrina?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, have you met before? Are you staff or a student here?
No,
You're a
student.
student, okay. You're from Germany?
Switzerland.
Switzerland. Good. Where?
Also.
Basel. Okay, we have a DBS starting next year in Wheeler,
Oh,
Switzerland.
yeah.
Yeah, good. All right, so my name is Jo, and this is my family.
Mein Name ist Jo, das ist meine Familie.
My oldest, my wife is Alicia. She is from Malaysia.
Lisa aus Malaysia.
And then we have our two boys. They are Joshua, who is in the middle, more or less in the middle of the picture, and Johan, the one with the long hair.
Joshua und Johann, genau.
I said with the long hair. Yeah, they both have long hair.
Yeah, I think he has actually longer hair.
Hey, that's right. Yeah.
He hasn't that long that you can tell.
Yeah. Yeah, Johan, our youngest, was doing his DTS in California, and then we met up in New York, and then he had all this funny, beautiful hair.
Happens in California.
So now our boys are adopted. They are from Taiwan.
Unsere Jungs sind adoptiert aus Taiwan.
So they are Taiwanese,
Also sie sind taiwanesisch.
and my wife is from Malaysia.
Meine Frau aus Malaysia.
I'm from Holland,
Ich bin aus Holland.
and we live in America.
Ich bin in Amerika.
The typical YWAM family.
Yep.
All right. I'll probably share more about my family during this week. I have a great story to tell that you probably will like. But why don't we go ahead and start with class a little bit first.
Ich werde noch mehr über meine Familie erzählen, aber bevor ich damit anfange, fangen wir doch erstmal mit normalem Unterricht an.
We finish at 10:30, right? The first session.
Yeah,
10:30.
yeah.
Okay, good. I just arrived from Holland last night at 1 a.m.
Ich bin gestern Abend um 1 erst aus Holland hier angekommen.
So if I look a little bit spaced out, you know why, from travel.
Wenn ich ein bisschen weggetreten reinschaue, dann liegt das da dran.
But it was not. But it's not. This is easy compared to what I did on Monday last week.
Aber das ist einfach verglichen mit dem, was ich am Montag gemacht habe.
Because then I flew in all the way from around the world, arrived in Cambridge, and then I had to go straight from the airport to the classroom and teach.
Da bin ich von den Staaten nach Cambridge geflogen und musste direkt vom Flughafen in den Unterrichtssaal gehen und unterrichten.
And I was teaching on 2nd Chronicles.
Ich habe über 2. Chronik.
No, I was teaching on 2nd Corinthians.
2. Korinther habe ich gelehrt dort.
But during the class I didn't remember. I had to ask the student, what book am I teaching?
Aber ich musste die Studenten fragen, welches Buch ich nochmal lehre.
And then I remember now again. So, but I hope we'll go better this time here than there, alright?
Ich hoffe, es läuft hier jetzt dann besser als da.
Okay, so what have we learned so far?
Was haben wir bisher gelernt?
We have begun reading in the book of Genesis.
Wir haben Genesis gelesen.
And that was what does the word Genesis mean? Beginnings.
Das heißt, Genesis, der Anfang.
Alright, so it's the beginning of the world,
Der Anfang der Welt,
of creation,
der Schöpfung,
of humans.
der Menschen.
It's also the beginning of sin
Das ist auch der Anfang der Sünde
and of God's redemptive plan.
und Gottes Wiederherstellungsplan.
And you guys are also tracing God's redemptive plan, right? As part of your homework.
Und wir müssen als Hausaufgabe ja auch den den Plan aufschreiben.
So that's awesome. Oh, I see you guys have the Ark of the Covenant right in the middle. Oh my gosh. God is right in the middle of us.
Wo ist das dort?
Yeah. And then we have the beginning of Israel.
Und dann haben wir den Anfang Israels.
Alright, and that is kind of like how the book is organized.
Und so ungefähr ist das Buch aufgestellt.
We talk, when we begin about, in Genesis chapter 12, we begin to read about Abraham.
Wir reden am Anfang ein bisschen über Abraham.
Now, who wrote this book?
Wer hat das Buch geschrieben?
Moses. Okay, very good. So, these are some of the things we need to remember every time when we read a book, and that is the basic questions we need to have asked, we need to have answered. And that is like, who is the author? Who is the original audience?
Also Fragen, die wir uns von Anfang an grundsätzlich bei jedem Buch stellen sollten, ist, von wem wurde das Buch geschrieben, für wen wurde das Buch geschrieben.
So we know that, but how does Moses know the story about Genesis? Because it happened hundreds of years earlier.
Und wie kennt Mose die Geschichte von Genesis, weil es Jahrhunderte vor ihm geschehen ist?
And that's because there was oral tradition passed on.
Weil es eine mündliche Überlieferung gab, die weitergegeben wurde.
Now, why would he write the book Genesis?
Warum würde er jetzt das Buch Genesis
To
schreiben?
who did he write?
An wen hat er geschrieben?
So I'm going to write. To who did he write? Who are the people that? Who are the first readers of the book?
Wer waren die ersten Leser des Buches? The people of Israel.
Okay, the people of Israel, and then the people of Israel that came out of Egypt. So the first generation of Israelites coming out of Egypt are the original readers of this book.
Also die ersten Leute, die aus Ägypten nach Israel gezogen sind die originellen Leser.
Now that's important because we need to remember the Bible. The Bible is not written to us.
Wir müssen uns daran erinnern, die Bibel ist nicht an uns geschrieben.
By the way, I have hay fever right now because of the spring. So when I sniff or sneeze, don't worry, it's not contagious. I'm not sick.
Also wenn niest oder Nase hochziehen muss, dann ist das nicht ansteckend.
And also like my nose is a little bit plugged up, so my voice maybe sounds strange, but I'm okay.
Also klingt vielleicht ein bisschen komisch, aber alles gut.
Komisch, yeah, that's very good. Yeah. Funny, that's right, that's good. Yeah. All right, so where am I? Where was I? Which book am I teaching? Oh yeah, well actually I'm not teaching Genesis. That's why I'm so confused. Don't worry, I'm going to go to David, okay? I mean, in his introduction, I'm not totally lost. But hey, seems like you guys already know, huh? Authorship, original audience, historical background, those are all important questions to ask.
Scheinbar kennt ihr alles schon, Autorenschaft, originaler Empfänger und historischer Hintergrund, was ja alles wichtige Fragen sind, die man beantworten sollte.
And so the very important thing we have learned in Genesis is the Abrahamic covenant.
Und was wichtig ist mit Abraham, ist der abrahamische Bund.
Alright, now why did Moses write this book?
Also warum hat Moses dieses Buch geschrieben?
To the Israelites coming out of Egypt.
An die Israeliten, die aus Ägypten kommen.
Giving them identity.
Good, to give them identity, very good.
Für Identität.
So that the people can say, I'm an Israeli.
Damit die Leute sagen können, ich bin ein Israelit.
If all they can say is, yeah, I was a slave,
Wenn sie nur sagen könnten, ja, ich war ein Sklave,
I was in a foreign land,
ich war in einem fremden Land.
that's maybe not a whole lot to be proud of, but now he can say, no, but I came from Abram, Isaac and Jacob. That's just like a longer history.
Dann wäre das vielleicht nichts, worauf man stolz sein könnte, aber so kann er sagen, ich komme von Abraham, Isaac und Jakob.
And if I would describe the book of Genesis with one word,
Und wenn ich das Buch Genesis mit einem Wort beschreiben müsste,
what word will you use?
Welches Wort würde das sein?
Well, we have beginnings,
Anfänge,
we have identity.
Identität.
Okay, I like the word election.
Ich mag das Wort Wahl,
And God elected a people.
weil Gott sich eine Nation ausgewählt hat.
Even when later in the New Testament we read about Paul, and Paul says that we have been elected by God.
Selbst wenn Paulus darüber schreibt, wie wir von Gott auserwählt wurden.
And then he talks about the church. I think he got it from also the story of Genesis, when God elected a people to become God's people.
Ich denke, er hat das auch aus Genesis, wo Gott eine Menschengruppe ausgewählt hat, seine Nation zu sein.
And so election would be to describe one word to describe book Genesis.
Also Wahl wäre eine Möglichkeit, das Wort zu beschreiben.
Then we have the second story, the second book.
Dann haben wir das zweite Buch.
Now, whereas the first book we can divide up in chapter 1 to 11 and then 12 to 15, Exodus we can divide up too.
So wie wir Genesis auch schön aufteilen können, können wir auch Exodus schön aufteilen.
It's a story about coming out of Egypt.
Das ist die Geschichte, um aus Ägypten rauszuziehen.
And so the first 18 chapters is about leaving Egypt behind.
Die ersten 18 Kapitel sind darüber, wie sie Ägypten zurücklassen.
And then the next 20 chapters or so is about meeting up with God at Mount Sinai.
Und die nächsten 20 Kapitel sind darüber, wie sie Gott am Berg Sinai treffen.
Okay, and so now we read about the Mosaic covenant.
Und jetzt lesen wir über den mosaischen Bund.
It's also very important.
Auch sehr wichtig.
Okay, and then what is God doing in the book of in this particular book?
Was tut Gott in diesem bestimmten Buch?
If God elected a people in Genesis,
Wenn Gott erwählte Leute im Genesis,
what is God doing now in Exodus?
was tut er dann jetzt im Exodus?
Not very difficult.
He's like
Huh?
forming a people.
Huh?
Forming a people.
Well, he's working on that, but that would be even more so in Leviticus. But in the story is about coming out of Exodus. So God is delivering a people. So,
Also er befreit eine Nation.
yeah, so the one word to describe the book would be deliverance. Yeah? And then we come to the next one, and it has more to do with forming also.
Es geht um Befreiung.
But if you say, for example, the beginning of, like what you, if you mean to say with forming a people, it's like, this day henceforth you are becoming my nation, yeah, then it would make sense, because there is of course a marriage happening at Mount Sinai. Yeah, a marriage between God and the people of Israel.
Ja, aber es ist wie wenn eine Ehe da passiert, von daher passt eine Nation zu formen natürlich.
Now, what's the most common word that we read about in Leviticus?
Was ist das häufigste Wort in Levitikus?
Very good, holy. Okay, and so again we can divide up the book in two halves.
Wir können das Buch wieder in 2 Hälften aufteilen.
And that is we read about all this sacrificial system and religion festivals, right?
Wir lesen über Opfer und Feste.
And so the first half of the book is about the way to God,
Und die erste Hälfte ist der Weg zu Gott.
and that they need to make sacrifice before they can come to God, so by means of sacrifice.
Und damit, dass sie Opfer bringen müssen, um zu Gott kommen zu können.
It's about approaching God.
Es geht darum, Gott zu erreichen.
But the second half of the book is about fellowshipping with God, about being in continual presence, fellowship with God, relationship with God.
Aber die nächste Hälfte ist, mit Gott unterwegs zu sein.
And so it's the walk with God, the walk with God.
Der Weg mit Gott.
And whereas the first half of the book, the way to God, the means is sacrifice.
Und wo in der ersten Hälfte der Weg zu Gott Opfer sind,
The second half of the book about walking with God, the means to walk with God is by way of obedience.
und beim zweiten Teil ist die Art, mit Gott unterwegs zu sein, Gehorsam.
And so again we read about covenant, and that is now, because of the tabernacle system with the Ark of the Covenant, the covenant with Abraham, the Mosaic covenant, these covenants are now made possible because the way to God has opened up, and they can come back to God by way of sacrificial, by way of making sacrifices.
Und durch die ganzen Sachen, die vorgestellt werden, ist jetzt alles ist möglich, zu Gott zu kommen und mit Gott unterwegs zu sein.
So, one word to describe the book, something about holiness.
Ein Buch, das viel über Heiligkeit beschreibt.
God in the first book was electing a people.
Im ersten Buch hat er sie ausgewählt,
Second book is delivering a people.
im zweiten Buch hat er sie herausgerufen.
Now he is sanctifying a people.
Jetzt heiligt er eine Nation.
The repeated phrase in Leviticus is about be holy because God is holy.
Die wiederholte Redewendung ist, seid heilig, denn Gott ist heilig.
They are called to be a godly, holy people, set apart for God.
Sie sind berufen, eine heilige Nation zu sein, abgesondert von den anderen.
Then we come to Numbers,
Dann kommen wir zu Numeri.
and the story is about rebellion.
Die Geschichte ist über Rebellion.
Though the people have seen many miracles,
Obwohl die Leute viele Wunder gesehen haben,
they decided to be stubborn in their unbelief
sie haben sich entschieden, stur in ihren Unglauben zu sein.
and often would go back to idolatry.
Gehen oft in Götzenverehrung zurück.
They would rebel against leadership.
Sie würden gegen Leiterschaft rebellieren.
All right, and so as we are reading the story, how is it divided? It talks about the journey that begins, but then also the journey that is halted, and then only later in the book the journey resumes. So there is like a slowdown, and they can't yet go into the promised land.
Also das große Bild ist ungefähr, die Reise beginnt in den ersten paar Kapiteln, dann in den nächsten. Die Reise wird unterbrochen und dann wird die Reise fortgesetzt am Schluss.
Now, what is God doing
Was tut Gott
with His people?
mit seinen Leuten?
We have already election.
Wir haben Erwählen,
We already have deliverance. We have sanctification.
Heiligen.
What is God doing now? In the book of Numbers, imagine my children are naughty
Stellt euch vor, ihr seid unartig.
and they need a spanking.
Unartig und die brauchen
Huh?
Hintern versohlt. What?
Judging?
Judging, yeah, but I don't judge my children.
Yeah.
Meine Kinder nicht.
So what is a parent doing?
Was tut ein Vater? Oder
Discipline.
Huh? Discipline. So God is disciplining His people.
er diszipliniert seine Nation.
Okay, and so only the second generation of the Israelites is allowed to go into the promised land.
Und deswegen ist nur die nächste Generation erlaubt, ins gelobte Land zu ziehen.
Alright, then we have Deuteronomy.
Und dann haben wir das 5. Buch Mose.
Okay, this book is about nation building.
Das Buch geht um Nationsbildung.
in the plains of Moab,
In dem Land Moab,
okay, which is over there. So that's, I guess, Moab right there in this area. This is not a very good map.
we could put up a newer. It says here Moab.
Okay, there we go. Moab, but it goes in the north too. So okay, so yeah, so Moab is right here. Yeah.
Yeah,
So in
hier ist Moab.
the plains of Moab is actually right here, where it says Ammon.
Ja,
Yeah.
also hier eigentlich wäre es.
Yeah, because where the Moabites live and what we call the plains of Moab is not exactly the same. So
Also die Landstriche Moabs und wo die Moabiter leben, ist nicht unbedingt dasselbe. Von daher,
yeah, and so here we see that. Okay, let's go on. So how's the book divided?
wie ist das Buch aufgebaut?
We have it's like in a format of covenant making.
In einem Format der Bundesschließung.
And so we have covenant history,
Also wir haben Bundesgeschichte,
covenant stipulation, like rules,
Bundesregeln,
and then the covenant ramifications, consequences.
die Bundeskonsequenzen.
All right, so that's kind of like how a typical ancient treaty would be made.
Wie ein normaler Bund damals so aufgebaut war.
And so many scholars believe that the book of Deuteronomy is organized, is structured the way a covenant is made.
Und viele Bibelwissenschaftler gehen davon aus, dass es aufgebaut ist wie ein Bund damals aufgebaut war.
And it is a typical structure that you see on the boards.
Das ist eine übliche Struktur, wie man es so sieht.
All right. Okay, so what is God doing now?
Und was tut Gott jetzt?
We already have election,
Wir haben Erwählung,
deliverance,
herausrufen,
what is it? No. Yeah, deliverance, sanctification,
Heiligung,
and then discipline.
disziplinieren.
And now God is covenant with his people.
Und jetzt verbündet sich mit seinem Volk.
Okay? And so now then we come to Joshua.
Und dann kommen wir zu Josua.
Okay? And so what happened in the book of Joshua?
Was passiert im Buch Josua?
They're conquering the Philistines.
Conquering the land. Very good. So the way we organize the book is first half the land is conquered, second half more or less, yeah, is when the land is divided.
Also der erste Teil des Buches ist, das Land wird erobert, der zweite Teil, das Land wird aufgeteilt.
So what is God doing now with the people of Israel?
Also was tut Gott jetzt mit den Leuten von Israel?
So we have election, deliverance, we have sanctification, discipline, covenant. What is God doing now?
Was tut Gott jetzt, nachdem wir die Dinge haben?
God has fulfilled his promises by giving the people the land.
Erfüllt seine Versprechen, indem man den Leuten das versprochene Land
One
gibt.
of the promises, one of the many promises God gave to Abraham is now fulfilled.
Eins der vielen Versprechen, die Abraham gegeben hat, ist jetzt endlich erfüllt.
And now we would think that the people of God will only go from glory to glory, that now that they are in the presence of God, have seen all the miracles and have even been given the land, they're going to be well behaved, right?
Man denkt sich, ja, die müssen sich ja jetzt super verhalten, die haben Gott erlebt, sind in ihrem verheißenen Land, also alles müsste perfekt sein.
Wrong.
Falsch.
And so we see that there is covenant failure.
Und dann haben wir den Bundesbruch.
All right, the people of Israel, the people of Israel entered into a covenant with God, but they did not fulfill their promises.
Die Leute aus Israel sind ins Land eingezogen, aber sie haben ihren Teil des Versprechens nicht erfüllt.
And so it's kind of a depressing book.
Und deswegen ist es so ein depressives Buch.
And you read about very bad stories, very bad things that happened.
Man liest schlimme Geschichten über schlimme Dinge, die geschehen sind.
To show the condition of the land. And we're talking about not the Canaanites, we now talk about the Israelites. But they behave like Canaanites, the very people that God had cast out of the land because of them.
Und sie verhalten sich wie Kanaaniter, obwohl sie die Israeliten sind. Und ja, genau, obwohl die Kanaaniter, die sind die Gott rausschmeißen wollte.
And even though God reaches out to them every time when they cry out to God, God will give them a deliverer, and we call that the judges. But then the moment the judge dies, the people will fall back again into idolatry and adultery and all kinds of sins.
Und Gott sendet ihnen immer wieder Richter und versucht sie auf den richtigen Weg zu bringen, aber sobald der Richter tot ist, fallen sie wieder in alles Mögliche und müssen wieder zurück.
So, what do we read about this book?
Was
About the
denken wir
book of
über dieses
Judges.
Buch?
Okay, we know now what God is doing in the previous 6 books.
Wir wissen, was Gott in den vorherigen 6 Büchern tut.
Okay, what is God now doing in Judges?
Was tut er in Richter?
Well, the people needed to be saved from themselves. They needed a David as a king.
Sie mussten vor sich selbst gerettet werden. Sie brauchten einen David als König.
Alright, so that is probably what the author was trying to convey in the book of Judges.
Das war wahrscheinlich das, was der Autor rüberbringen wollte im Buch Richter.
And so we see that David, and now we are coming to the David week. Alright, Samuel is promoting a Davidic kingship, a kingship that is instead of Saul and the tribe of Benjamin, they want to have a king of David from the tribe of Judah.
Ja, und das Buch Samuel zeigt wunderbar oder stellt die davidische Königschaft in ein sehr gutes Licht im Gegensatz zu der benjamitischen Ursprung mit Saul als König. Das ist dann nicht so gut bekommt.
And so now we have come to present time in our story, and that's David.
Und da sind wir an dem Punkt angelangt, wo wir geschichtlich in der Bibel sind.
When it comes to God's redemptive plan,
wenn es über Gottes Erlösungsplan
when
geht,
did God's redemptive plan start?
wann hat Gottes Erlösungsplan angefangen?
When Adam and Eve fell, yeah.
Yeah, and then what happened? What did God say?
Was hat Gott gesagt dort?
It's very important. You would not want to skip that one when you do the sharing of God's story at the end of lecture, at the end of 12 weeks of class.
Nach den 12 Wochen wollt ihr das nicht vergessen. Was ist ganz wichtig, was da gesagt wurde?
You guys know that you guys do a presentation at the end of class, at school, right?
Wir machen ja eine Präsentation am Ende der Schule.
You guys make timelines?
Yes.
Ihr
Okay.
macht
Great. I would like to see them someday. You know, like, are you guys? Some of you guys really artists, making it really beautiful. I'm not like that too, but I always look for the artists. Yeah?
Some of them do.
Oh, good. All right. Well then, what's the first thing you mention when you talk about God's redemptive plan?
Das ist das Erste, worüber man redet, wenn man über Gottes Wiederherstellungsplan redet.
Yes.
The promise is that the snake will, the man will crush the snake.
Very good. Genesis 3 verse 15.
Genesis 3:15.
So even though Adam and Eve sinned, and because of that sin entered into the world, and death entered into the world,
Obwohl Adam und Eva gesündigt haben und Sünde und Tod Einzug in die Welt gehalten haben,
God did not abandon us,
Gott hat uns nicht allein gelassen,
but began to make certain promises that there will come a deliverance, and God will restore us.
wo Gott dann verheißen hat, da kommt ein Erlöser und er wird euch befreien.
And so he says to the serpent, I will cause hostility between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your hand and you will strike his heel.
Und
Genesis 3 verse 15.
yeah, reading it is probably smarter.
I'm sorry?
Reading it is probably smarter than just
Yeah.
fulfilling it.
Hmm.
Von nun an setze ich Feindschaft zwischen dir und der Frau und deinem Nachkommen und ihrem Nachkommen. Er wird dir den Kopf zertreten und du wirst ihn in die Ferse reißen.
Very good. And then on Genesis 12 verse 3.
von Genesis 12, Vers
we see
3.
that God now speaks to Abraham.
Sehen wir, dass Gott zu Abraham spricht.
Okay, that a nation will come out of Abraham.
Dass eine Nation auch aus Abraham kommen wird.
And then God says, in your offspring, all the people will be blessed.
Und er sagt,